very happy to welcome all of you here. I particularly want to thank the panel who's here that Michael Greenstone will be introducing more formally in a moment. We're here to talk about energy. I just wanted to say one or two words about that and indicate the very particular and special role that Michael Greenstone is playing at the University of Chicago right now. So I think all of us here recognize that energy is a complicated problem. It's a technical science and engineering problem. It's a economics and policy problem. It's a private sector problem. It's a cultural problem because it's a global problem. And so all of these components have to be brought together if there's actually going to be any solution to what I think all of us recognize is an issue. The University of Chicago has a long history in science, has a long history in economics and policy, has a long history in cultural issues, and so on. And one of the things we wanted to do was to attempt to bring these things together in a serious way. And we formed what we've called the Energy Policy Institute in Chicago, goes under the acronym EPIC. And we brought Michael Greenstone back to Chicago from MIT in order to be the faculty person who was going to run this, because he likewise shared this view that in order to address this problem in a deep, substantive, and lasting way, one needed to actually be able to integrate these multiple strands that help define this problem. So that's all I'm going to say right now. Again, I want to express my appreciation for your being here. After this panel, there'll be a reception, which I urge you to come and eat and drink heavily. And right now, I just introduce Michael Greenstone, who's economist at the University of Chicago, the Milton Friedman Professor at the University of Chicago, and one of the world's great energy economists. Michael?
Thanks, Bob, for the very generous introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming. I especially wanted to thank our really all-star Hall of Fame level set of panelists here. Closest to me, we have Jinyong Tsai, who's the Executive Vice President and CEO of the International Finance Corporation at the World Bank. He was formerly Chief Executive of Goldman Sachs' China Securities Venture. Next to him is Carol Browner. I used to work with her for 1 year in the White House. She's the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. She's a former director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy. And for, I believe, the entire Clinton administration, the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And then our third member is Jairam Ramesh, who's, people often complain about political systems and they want to blame politicians. We brought Jairam here for that. He's a member of the Indian Parliament. He's a chair of the Future Earth Engagement Committee. He's the former Indian Minister of State, was in charge of rural development, and before that, the Minister of Environment and Forests. And apropos tonight, he was the chief negotiator for India in the 2009 UN Climate Change Conference. So we really have a stupendous panel, and I think my job here is to just try and set the stage a little bit and then get out of the way and let them talk. So I put together a couple slides that just to kind of frame the energy challenge. Everyone on this panel thinks about the energy challenge every day, but maybe to establish a set of common facts. So the point I'm going to make here is that, in my view, the energy challenge really has three pillars. The first is energy access, and we'll talk a little bit about that, the degree to which there's large parts of the world who don't have access to reliable energy. The second is the air pollution and resulting health problems that are a consequence of the forms of energy we rely on. And then the third, of course, is climate changes. Probably in Davos, it's hard to have a conversation where climate change doesn't come up one way or another. And all of those are interrelated in the ways that President Zimmer outlined. And I'm gonna try and provide a little specificity here. So the first, this is like a graph that I think everyone instinctually understands, but it's always striking when I look at it. And it just shows the relationship between, on the x-axis, energy consumption and GDP. And for people who play with data all the time, like myself, data is kind of like your worst girlfriend or your worst boyfriend. Like, it disappoints you in a million ways, and you can never quite figure out which way it's going to be next. And here is a setting where data actually tells a really consistent story. You cannot have growth, you cannot have high levels of income without lots of energy consumption. So it's worth unpacking what's in that graph a little bit, I thought. And so here I just pulled off a couple of the data points here. And looking at electricity consumption measured in kilowatt hours per capita on an annual basis. And you can see the United States is right at the top, about 13,246 kilowatt hours per person per year. And we also have Germany and Russia. And I've circled, and you notice we also have population, China and India. China's at about 3,300. India is at about 700. I think this data is a couple years old, so maybe they're at 800 or 900 now. The state of Bihar, which is in India, is at 122 kilowatt hours per person. So that's about operating a 60-watt bulb for 6 hours per day for a full year. What I want you to take away from that is that's not going to remain like that. These countries are anxious for growth. They're growing. And in the coming decades, we're just going to see lots and lots of increase in energy consumption. And I think the critical question is, well, what kind of energy consumption, or how are we going to source that energy? And there, too, I think the next slide helps to provide a little context for that. So this is admittedly just from the United States, but I think it's very telling. So I've plotted the cost of producing a kilowatt hour of electricity. From the first bar is an existing coal plant, the next one is an existing natural gas plant, the next two are new natural gas and new coal. And what you can see is it's very cheap to get a kilowatt hour of electricity. If you want to use an existing coal plant, it's about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, the reason that I have the next few bars on there, so why would anyone ever choose the more expensive forms, of course, is that those are kind of the low carbon and the low pollution sources of energy. And what you can see, though, is in order to get rid of the air pollution that's a result of using coal, or to reduce the rate of climate change, one is going to have to use forms of electricity that are maybe 3 or 4 times as expensive. And that's just a conscious choice that'll have to be made one way or another. So one thing I want to emphasize, though, is in that previous graph, that's just reporting how much it costs to produce kilowatt hour of electricity. It doesn't account for what economists like to call externalities. So that is the social cost from, say, burning coal, which takes the form of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. And so this picture, which is one of my favorite pictures, and is one, there's a lot of information packed in this picture, I think helps to highlight that the choice of energy really does matter a great deal. And so what you have here in this picture, I think, is an amazing set of things. First, you have the guy on the bicycle. He's riding along. And what you can see is he's being separated from the cars on the other side of this metal gate. And you can just feel the motion. It's almost like in a blink of an eye, the guy in the car was on the bike, and the guy on the bike is going to be in a car. And you can feel the economic growth. This is from China. And you can also see the cost of that, pursuing the extra consumption of electricity or energy. The guy's wearing a mask, eye mask, he's a face mask. And then, of course, what you can't see there is the greenhouse gas emissions, which are obviously operating in the background. But in many respects, I think this captures a lot of the energy challenge. So it's natural to also just take a quick look at climate change. here's a picture I made of the number of days that a typical person in the United States currently faces. That's the gray bar. Where the temperature is greater than 90, that's the average temperature. So it's average of the high and the low. So the average person faces about 1 day a year. With unrestrained climate change, what you see is a really dramatic increase in the number of hot days. And so although we're used to thinking about climate change as something that's going to change mean temperatures by a couple degrees, what's really telling is it's giving you a lot of the really hot days. And the reason that's important is that the hot days are where the bad stuff are. That's where the crops have a hard time. That's where health problems take on a big role in people's lives. And one way, economists are most comfortable summarizing things in terms of dollars. And so here is an estimate from the Risky Business Project, which some of you may be familiar with, of what, if we stay on the current path, the associated climate damages would be at the end of the century. And you can see there's a lot of uncertainty, but the damages at the end of the century for the US would be, GDP would be about 3% lower every year. And that's troubling, but what's really troubling is this long tail here. And there's a decent amount of probability that you could have the 8% or the 10% loss. And so the difficulty is that when people choose their energy consumption currently, they do not base it on the loss of life expectancy from the air pollution or from the climate change, just that raw cost of producing it, which I showed previously. And so what I want to add, and I think this will end with, rather, I think this will fit right with the discussion we're going to have, is the challenge, I think, for the world is that, with respect to climate change, is that the countries that are going to grow the most in terms of energy consumption are the ones that have the lowest levels of income currently. And one way to measure that is it was depicted on this graph, which is the share since the history of time of cumulative world greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see the US is the winner in that category. We count for more than 20% of historical emissions. But as time goes on, most of the growth is going to be coming from countries like China and India, and the US share will decline. By the end of the century, it'll be about 12%. And you can see there'll be this very dramatic increase in China's share. And in many respects, that's the energy challenge. How can, as I like to say, the most interesting energy problems really are outside of the United States. And it'll be decided in places like India and China, what level of air pollution do we want to have, how much energy access do we want to have, and to what degree will the climate change. So with that background, let me now get to the real stars of the show here. So I thought I'd begin with you, Jinyong, and wondered if you could talk a little bit about what will it look like to get India from 900 kilowatt hours per person to, say, 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000, and what will it look like around the rest of the world? How will those countries achieve that?
The picture you just put there, based on the current population, about 7 billion. Right? When you think of access to energy, I would explain it from two perspectives. One is access to electricity, which is really the key for modern life, right? And the world still has 1.2 billion people have no access to power, and the majority of that is in sub-Saharan Africa. And I have a list of the countries. It's very interesting. South Sudan, 1.5% population have access to power. Chad, 3.5. Liberia, 4.1. I mean, the whole sub-Saharan Africa, we have about 1 billion people right now in Africa as a whole. The projection is going to be, by 2050, 2 billion people. So how do we meet that demand? And certainly India is certainly moving pretty fast in terms of economy. There's a lot of hope, but the major constraint for the Indian economy is really electricity. And I want to make sure that it's not just access to power, you have lights, right? It's important you start from that so kids can start to read, to get education. But more importantly, for a country like India, is really you need to create a modern economy, you need to create jobs. Majority of that will be in manufacturing, because as the economy continues to grow, many more people will want to live in the cities. So it's very hard, kind of to only look at the static projection, because there's an urbanization angle as well. And imagine, the picture in China, that's where I'm from, Beijing, is just so familiar with Karen coming with also. So we were told we have kind of a sacrificed 7 years life because living in Beijing. China's situation is like, China consumes about 50% of the coal consumption of the world, 4 billion tons a year. Actually, the electricity generation is one of the most efficient in China in coal-burning, coal-fired power plants. A lot of the pollution there is coming from steel making. China produces about 60% of the steel in the world, 60% of the cement. So these are, when you think of, you ask the question about India, if you add on Pakistan, 200 million people, Bangladesh, 150 million people. In South Asia alone, we are talking about, 1.2, we're talking about 1.6 billion people now. It's going to grow to 2 billion. And you have Africa, going to be 2 billion people. When you think of this grand challenge to meet not only basic access to power, have a light you can read, and also have a manufacturing industry you can create some income. It's not only lots of money, it's really what are the impact on air pollution, but more importantly on climate change. The second perspective I want to explain is not just access to power. And today, perhaps one of the most important pollution source is really cooking. India has about 400 million people using biomass, basically woods and animal dung to cook. And Africa, even more percentage-wise. And in terms of air pollution, today, that's really perhaps the most, not only polluting air and cutting trees, that's another damage on the climate issue, and also very dangerous. And there's a number saying 4 million people in developing countries die each year because of pollution using just a traditional cooking biomass, and which is more than malaria or the other disease combined. So that's really the challenge. Not, electricity is part of it, and really let's start from basic cooking. How can we make the cooking, is just really a more modern, reduce the pollution? So they have major challenges.
Okay, thank you. Carol, I always find myself slightly more optimistic after I talk to Carol than before I talk to Carol. And so I thought we had a fascinating car ride up here from Zurich, and again, she made me feel more optimistic. And what we were talking about was, well, it just used to be that everyone in the U.S. accepted that air pollution was going to be unbearable in some cities. And as recently in the 1960s, in Gary, Indiana, white-collar workers brought 2 shirts to work, counting on 1 shirt to be dirty by midday. And then something happened. It happened pretty quickly. Like change oftentimes seems like it can't come, and then all of a sudden it happens much more quickly than you imagine it could. So Carol has basically been involved in the fight and success against air pollution in the United States for several decades, and I wondered if you could share some of the lessons you learned and help us think about whether or not that might help in other places in the world, and what it would take.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Michael and the University of Chicago. I particularly want to thank you for saying that a former regulator brings out optimism in you. Not many people refer to someone who ran the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 8 years as an optimist. Someone
this is
was
a very
once,
special panel, Carol.
Someone was once introducing me and wanted to point out that I had run this department for 8 years, and it was the longest that anyone had ever done the job. These are political appointments. You're a member of a president's cabinet. And they wanted to say, and she's the longest serving administrator of the EPA, but instead they said she's the longest suffering administrator of the EPA, which tells you something about the view of regulators. But I think that I want to go back to the picture for a second, because I think it's a really, really important picture. And we had pictures like that in the U.S., as recently as 30, 40 years ago, where you literally, Pittsburgh, you couldn't see across the city skyline because the pollution was so dense. And so as we think about these issues of energy access, not only do we need to think about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, I think we also have to think about conventional pollutants, because they're coming with the increase in GHG as the world seeks to modernize, as we seek to provide electricity to all of these parts of the world. And so I wanted to take a moment to say sort of how the United States did it, what I thought was important in that. But in taking you through that history, I would also note this is how the U.S. is going to manage greenhouse gas emissions. We are using the same tools right now to manage our greenhouse gas emissions, which we are pushing down, that we use to manage conventional pollution. The original commitment to air pollution was an interesting one, and it is still on the books today. It was sort of a moral and ethical commitment. Richard Nixon is the president at the time. He creates the Environmental Protection Agency, and Congress passes a slew of laws, and it says when it comes to conventional air pollutants, so smog and soot, those things you can see and kind of feel and taste, it says that EPA shall look at the science every 5 years. It recognizes that science might evolve, should set a standard based on that science that protects the public health with a margin of safety. It is literally a sentence. And out of that comes a tremendous effort to set these science-based standards. Once that happens, first phase of the process, then EPA looks at what are the sources of the pollution. Is it the power sector? Is it, we make a distinction in the United States between what we call mobile sources, things that move on roads, cars and trucks, things that have smokestacks, stationary sources. What are the sources of that pollution, and how much should each sector contribute to the reductions? When I was running EPA, I set the first ever fine particle standard, the little tiny, tiny microns that can become embedded in lungs and contribute to premature deaths, particularly in older citizens, and was sued immediately. As you might imagine, if you run the EPA, you're sued frequently by some who don't agree with you. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the argument in the Supreme Court is that rather than looking at just the science and the public health impacts, I should have looked at how much it would cost to reduce the pollution and whether or not those costs were outweighed by the benefits. And we had, in fact, looked at the cost to industry to reduce their pollution. We had looked at the benefits, and we had concluded that the benefits were greater than the cost. But we argued in the Supreme Court that isn't what the law said, that the law said protect the public health based on the best available science. Supreme Court upheld my decision 9-0, which if you know anything about our Supreme Court, that is not a common victory in the Supreme Court. And one of our most conservative justices, Justice Scalia, actually wrote the majority opinion. And so this idea of best science protecting public health continues to really drive how the U.S. focuses on air pollution and now sits behind what President Obama is attempting to do on climate change. Congress has not changed the law. He is using a law from 1990 as he begins the efforts to regulate greenhouse gases. The first thing he had to do was make a science finding that greenhouse gases, climate change, endangers public health and welfare. Lisa Jackson, one of my successors at EPA, did that early in the Obama administration. And then out of that came the requirements for the car companies to produce more fuel-efficient vehicles. And right now, the U.S. is on a trajectory to achieve a fuel efficiency on a sort of company-by-company basis, so across your entire fleet, if you're Audi, if you're Mercedes, if you're BMW, of 54.5 miles per gallon. This is huge from where we started by model year 2025. He has moved on now, the president has moved on to power plants. But I think what's really essential in the effort of the U.S. to reduce conventional pollutants and now greenhouse gases is this idea that and I'm on a panel with economists, but that it's not simply the cost and the benefit. And so one final point. What people like me see and I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer by training, when we look at a cost benefit, and we did a lot of them while I was at EPA, what we've learned is that when you project the cost on the front end, before the regulation is in place, before industry is told to reduce their pollution, the cost projections will generally be higher than what actually comes to pass. Because once you put the regulation in place, you create a market opportunity. And there's a lot of competition for the new solutions, and the cost of compliance of reducing pollution come down. The second thing that history shows us is that the benefits you project early on from less pollution will turn out to be in error, and that they will usually be greater than what you anticipated. So lower cost, higher benefits. And one of the arguments I would make against a system that limited the kind of pollution standards you would set to that would say a cost-benefit analysis would dictate the level of standards is you sell yourself short because you fail to capture innovation and ingenuity that can get us better solutions. Now, there's a big push in the US from the conservative side to move towards a cost-benefit analysis, but the history suggests that continuing to do it the way we've done it over the last 30 or 40 years actually get us better, more common sense, more cost-effective outcomes than we might otherwise have gotten.
Thanks. Jairam, now I don't know if you remember this, but the first time we met, I was in you had a bunch of people, all the states were there reporting to you. And I was there to make a small presentation, and then you asked a question, and I raised a hand, so you could try this. I had never met a politician before with such a curious mind, and so interested in ideas, and I've been thrilled to have you as a friend since. But the question I wanted to ask you is, you were India's negotiator in 2009 at the Copenhagen Accord. We're heading towards the Paris negotiations. We saw in those figures, India and China are on a path to have lots and lots of greenhouse gas emissions. You think there's a way to avoid that, or is that's just a natural part of moving up from 900 kilowatt hours per year of electricity?
Since you've raised the issue of Paris, Michael, let me make 4 very brief observations on what I see is the road to Paris. First, Paris will be a springboard. It will not be the final destination. It will be the springboard of a pathway for a low-carbon economy for major economies of the world. 2, that all negotiations on climate present trilemmas, not dilemmas. You have to have something that is politically feasible, that is something economically desirable, and something that is environmentally optimal. And in Paris, what you're going to get is an outcome that is not environmentally optimal, but that is politically and economically acceptable. Third, the commitments that countries are making. Unfortunately, even the word commitment has been diluted. It's now contributions, as if countries are doing a favor to humanity. So it's now INDC, in UN speak, intended, not even, something that you're pledging. It's intended nationally determined contributions. Now, it's a bottom-up approach. It's completely different from the Kyoto Protocol, which is a top-down approach. But this is the approach that countries like the US, like China, like India, the 3 biggest fossil fuel economies, are comfortable with. And that's what you're going to get in Paris. That you're going to get a series of countries, across countries, making these contributions, but what you have to lock in Paris is a system that will ensure compliance with those contributions. So key in Paris is not the contributions, which is well known, but key in Paris will be the compliance. What is the compliance mechanism that the international community is going to work out? And fourth and final point, Michael, is that we really have to have Paris Plus. Because Paris itself is not going to solve the 2-degree Celsius problem. So what you need is for economies like the US, like China, India, Russia, the European Union has already unveiled it, but for at least these major economies to say that this is our low carbon trajectory for the next 15 to 20 years. These are not philosophically, but in terms of milestones, that these are the milestones that we are going to commit ourselves to. So I think Paris is really going to be the starting point of a pathway. Now, unfortunately, the graph that the tables that you have showed, Michael, China has already committed to a peaking year in the bilateral agreement for 2030. Now, I have a simple rule for India. Whatever China does, add 20 years, because that's the gap between India and China. So China plus 20 is the peaking year for India.
Yes.
But the dilemma we face is the following, that we are unable in the current atmosphere to increase the contribution of nuclear power. From an environmental point of view, nuclear is really, from a climate point of view, the best option. But all environmentalists are opposed to nuclear power. I mean, there's a paradox here. And in the short to medium term, which I define as the next 10 to 15 years, I see no alternative to coal. Now, this is a very depressing thing for me to say, but that's the reality. That if you want to increase per capita electricity consumption from 800 units for India to say even 3,000 units like it is in China, I can't see how, without the use of coal, countries like India are going to accomplish this. So I'm afraid we are in a situation where developing countries cannot abdicate or cannot foreclose the nuclear option, and they certainly cannot foreclose the coal option.
Jin-Yong, as I understand it, you help countries figure out what they're going to do with their energy systems. Is that right? We're destined to a world of coal?
Well, because I'm
So
in the World Bank, I'll be
but
careful.
we're kind of so I don't think a single Davos panel can end with people being depressed. So we need you to lift the mood here. But I know we're going to hold Carol in reserve.
There are a couple of facts about coal. Nowadays, certainly China is the biggest kind of a user of coal. Actually, let's just use the conventional coal-fired power plant. Actually, the efficiency has become much better. Supercritical 1,000 megawatts units, made in Japan, made in China. I think in many ways, I do agree with you, in the next 15, 20 years, unless we figure out a way to power India and, I mentioned about Pakistan, there's no really alternative unless you like China. China's way to do this 2030 commitment is they have planned to build 50 nuclear reactors. And they are planning to build many more large hydro. And certainly they already have the biggest kind of a capacity, installed capacity in wind. The installed capacity in wind in China is about 100,000 megawatts. That's bigger than the whole UK total generation capacity combined. And they now have about 40,000 megawatts solar, and that is going to increase in another few years, maybe another UK. I mean, you do a lot of those things, but you need the base load. I think the base load, if you have no emission with nuclear, hydro, and if that's not good enough, we can't do anything. There has to be some coal, there will be natural gas, and that will be the fuel mix we can kind of handle over the next 15, 20 years, hoping maybe the technology will continue to develop. Maybe eventually carbon capture will be viable, which I do not know. And that's the reality we're facing.
So
I know Carol.
I want to start by saying I'm an environmentalist who's also pro-nuclear. And I'm pro-nuclear for a very simple reason. I think that climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, carbon pollution are the biggest issue the world faces, and it would be completely inconsistent to take off the table a source of energy, base load to your point, that doesn't emit carbon. And so about 10, 15 years ago, I thought about this and realized that I should be pro-nuclear, and you know, I continue to believe that the U.S. needs to maintain its existing nuclear fleet. Whether or not the U.S. can build a lot of new nuclears, there's some under construction right now, it's very expensive, and with low natural gas prices, without pricing in the externalities of pollution, without pricing in the externalities of carbon, without putting some sort of cap on carbon, the nuclear industry, new nuclear is going to have a very, very hard time, if not impossible time. But there are a few environmentalists out there who see a role for nuclear. The one thing I think it would be important to note about coal, and I think this is so in 1990, the United States is having a debate about updating its Clean Air Act, and there's a lot of focus on the pollution from the coal-fired power plants, and a lot is put into the law to, you know, to look at coal-fired power plants. The industry argues, well, for our older coal-fired power plants, you shouldn't make us upgrade our pollution, like our scrubbers and things like that, the things that reduce the pollution, because we're going to take them offline. They're old. They are just now coming offline. That was the argument made in 1990. So this infrastructure that gets built, whether it be a coal infrastructure or whether it be a natural gas infrastructure, we have to assume it is with us for a very long time. The average age, I looked it up today, the average age of a coal-fired power plant in the United States is in the mid-40s, 42, 45 years old. So when we think about, you know, we talk about, well, coal's going to play a role for the next 10, 15, 20 years. That's not the history. The history is that it'll be a much longer role. I think today in the U.S., we sometimes like to talk about it, those of us in, you know, consider ourselves environmentalists, that natural gas is a bridge, that don't worry, we're going to get to something else. We're going to get to renewables. We're going to get to these alternatives. But again, we're building an infrastructure. We're capitalizing an infrastructure. And it's hard to walk away from those infrastructures. And so I personally believe that natural gas will be with us probably much longer than people have, you know, like to project. But I think, you know, what we, if coal is a reality, and you may be right, then we really do have to think about what do you do to minimize the emissions. And I think that's where the carbon capture, can you, for those of you who don't follow the nuances of this, can you literally capture the carbon that is generated in the burning of coal and sequester it in some way? Because if you can't do that, then all of these statistics we're looking at, or these projections we're looking at, are quite frightening.
Two very quick points, Michael. I think on coal, of course, clean coal is a contradiction in terms, but cleaner coal is certainly possible. And I think we are not doing enough on the cleaner coal front, both in terms of the mining aspect, you know, which has disastrous environmental consequences and consequences on public health, and more importantly, in the utilization of coal. And today, the new generation of coal-fired power plants that are coming in at much higher levels of efficiency than the coal plants that Carol spoke about. So I'm actually quite optimistic that given a concentrated technological effort, cleaner coal will not be the type of disaster that the original coal utilization in the US and China was. The second point I want to make is that amidst all this sort of, you know, inevitabilities that are there, I would like to make special mention of what Germany has done. And actually, with all due respect to the Germans who are present in the audience, Germany has no business being the world leader in solar energy. It has no comparative advantage in solar energy. But 37 gigawatts, the world's largest solar energy producer, is Germany. And today, 29% of electricity supply comes from renewables, base supply, not peak supply. So it is possible, and Germany is not a small country, you know, industrialized, advanced, world's leading trading country, 80 million population. So my question to you, Michael, is the Germans can do it, why can't the Americans? Because if the Americans do it, the pressure on China and India sort of, you know, gets mitigated. Right now, because the Americans can't do anything, everybody's putting the heat on China and India. I think that's a bit unfair.
Wait, hold on. I have to defend the American.
I have a different view about Germany.
Things.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm not going to answer for. Let me answer a different question.
Let me pick up on the Germany issue, okay? I think there's I would say we need to look at the fact. Germany, they do not produce single PV panel. Where all those polluting process happen is in China. Germany has been able to create an industry in China. When I was in Goldman, I financed a lot of those PV manufacturers. I often wonder, per kilowatt capacity made in China, shipped to Germany, how much pollution they have left behind China for the German electricity generation. By the way, Germany's problem is you have suddenly the cost of energy gone up by 50%.
Yeah,
if you talk to the German utilities, they often say first mover, first loser. Okay, Germany has spent 100 billion euro in putting this renewable system into it. And we all know the problem renewable. Germany is not a country with a lot of sunshine. For whatever reason, they believe they have a lot of sunshine. And basically, the intermittent nature of the renewable make the power system literally unmanageable. Okay, so you basically create Germany I agree with, is a very rich country, but the Germans' competitiveness for their own economy will suffer because of this. So that's really the issue. Can any other country afford to do that? And not to mention, pollution, we are all polluting the same earth, right? Most pollution happens in China. That's the issue. I don't know if Germany will be a model for any country. And by the way, Germany also shut down the nuclear. And they have 7 coal-fired power plants under construction today. Germany today, in terms of CO2 emission, is more than when they started this whole campaign.
So can I just say something about the U.S. and then to my friend from India? First of all, the U.S., I think, does deserve some credit, particularly President Obama. He's done cars. It's the first ever greenhouse gas standards on cars in the world. Could it have been more? Should it be more? It's a beginning. You have to get started. The second thing is he's doing power plants. Yes. And I mean, that is real. He is setting greenhouse gas standards on power plants, and that will be done before he leaves office. I think when we talk about things like cleaner coal, we have to back up for a second and say, what will stimulate the investment in cleaner coal technologies, whether it's carbon capture or better efficiency, et cetera? That's where the role of government has to come in, and that's where political will has to come in, because you can look all over the world, and the only time we make real progress in reducing pollution, whether it be air pollution, water pollution, you name it, toxic chemicals, is when the governments set a standard and they create a level playing field. And without that kind of individual government by government leadership, I think this is going to be really hard. In the U.S., in the states, we have 50 states, 20 some of them have on the books a requirement that a certain percentage of the electricity production come from renewables. And it's happening, and it's competitive. And so, I think that when India thinks about things like cleaner coal or I won't go to Germany because that's just complicated, it will require a certain level of political leadership. And you shared with us earlier today where the current government in India appears to be headed on the idea of the national government setting pollution standards. And they may be headed backwards, not forwards. And that will not bode well for things like cleaner coal.
So I just want to return to the Germany example. I think it's important. So first of all, my take on what Germany did is they just agreed to pay a higher price for electricity. That's the choice I meant to tee up on that slide. That's great, they did that, but I think the only way to really confront this, there's really only 2 ways to confront this. The first is you could make fossil fuels more expensive, and the way you would do that is by having some kind of carbon tax or cap and trade. Countries have been very reluctant to do that. And I should point out, as almost a side point, in the background of that, the fossil fuel industries have been just remarkable at driving down their costs. The fracking revolution in the US, which will soon spread around the world, has really driven down the cost of getting fossil fuels out of the ground. So, but one option is make fossil fuels more expensive. The other is to find some way to make low carbon energy sources less expensive. And I wanted to talk about that. So that's another classic case for government intervention is to do the R&D that private firms would never do because it can be appropriated by their competitors. And that is a policy path that I have seen even less progress on than on finding ways to make fossil fuels more expensive or require renewables. So I wondered if any of you would be willing to talk about that and what might be the path forward on R&D, kind of the basic R&D that might lead to the breakthrough that would completely change the arithmetic of that table.
What I know is on nuclear, Carrie mentioned about nuclear, actually the nuclear technology also evolving. New nuclear power plant today is much less dangerous. And the Bill Gates Foundation, Bill Gates support new nuclear.
We have Tetra, yeah.
Yeah, and actually he has founded a research team, actually happened in China, doing this low radiation, I don't know enough. Hopefully if that would work, if indeed, I hope if that technology can become available, if the Chinese build a few, they really can demonstrate this is different from the old technology, that would be a solution. And also there
Do they have projections on cost for that? I mean,
I don't know. It's still in the lab, I guess.
Because one thing that's not appreciated about nuclear is there's the environmental pushback on that. But you can set that aside. That nuclear is out of the money. Like the natural gas, there's no nuclear plant being built because no one can make money doing it. So that's...
No. The Chinese, they view the air pollution is already reached a level. Yeah. They're willing to pay for that. Another R&D, actually this is happened at the company level. Duke Energy and Huaneng, this is one of the leading power producers. They are doing a carbon capture power plant near Beijing. And I heard there's another one coming in the United States. Yes. Either somewhere in Oklahoma, somewhere, there's another government-supported carbon capture project going. I think they are, people realize this is the issue, and both at the private sector and government level, there are variety of experiment R&D going on.
Well, I think on the R&D front, Michael, there are many options beyond 2050, but we are now looking at the option of whether by 2030 or 2040 some new energy source can be developed, which will also have positive effects on climate. And for me, I think I come back, if there are cleaner ways of using coal gasification, for example, it's far less futuristic than fusion or some of the nuclear issues that are on the table. So I think, what we need today is an international effort for developing such alternatives which not only meet your clean energy needs, but also fulfill your climate objectives. For that, a carbon price is absolutely essential. And I think the carbon tax, now is the time for a carbon tax. With oil prices being what they are and the way they are headed, I think countries must, you're not going to get an international agreement on a carbon price, but at least individual countries can take the step forward to introduce carbon tax within their economies and then hope that internationally we can agree on whether it's $20 a ton or $25 a ton of CO2. But I think the carbon tax is the first step before we start thinking of R&D and so on and so forth.
So
I think
I just wanted to
history shows us on conventional pollutants is when we set a standard, when we say there's this much pollution, pick your conventional pollutant in the air, and it needs to be here, that then drives a whole host of important activities, both from the public sector in terms of trying to find new solutions. When I was at EPA, we got 11 patents on technologies, anti-pollution technologies we developed in the government. And that story can be told, much more so across the federal agencies. And then the private sector sees a market opportunity. They understand that somebody, a power plant, a coal-fired power plant, is going to have to buy their technology. And so they make the investments. And so until we are prepared to put some sort of cap on carbon. Now, maybe in the US we can't do an economy-wide cap. We did try it. We weren't successful. Maybe we have to kind of work through sector by sector. So you do cars and trucks through a regulatory regime. You do power plants through what the president is trying to do now. You look at refineries, the other big sources. But until you actually use the government's regulatory power to say, we're going to have less of this, I don't think you're going to create, and what history says is you're just not going to create the kind of investment, the drive towards the private sector investment that actually brings these new solutions to market.
Can I just come down one more? So we didn't have time to discuss, which is hydro. I think hydro, certainly we have to do that in a environmentally, socially responsible way, can be a part of the solution. And the reason I mentioned this, when we talk about China, India, remember there's Africa, which has the lowest access to power. And not only, this is not just about basic access to power issue. Africa's instability is really because of lack of economic development. What do we do? I think hydro in Africa can play a critical role. And if you ask me what would be the solution for energy issue in Africa, I would say big hydro, small hydro, some natural gas combined with renewable. We do not have to do coal in Africa. The reason I mention this is there's a dream project in Africa called the Grand Inga. It's a river in Democratic Republic of Congo. And Grand Inga, if 8 dams, they built 3. If all these dams are built, by the way, this is much less impact, had much less impact on the environment, on social. I've been there, I've seen it. It's really the Congo River before got into the Atlantic Ocean has a rapid drop about 200 meters waterhead. And basically, there literally no people live there. They can't do transportation either. That project, in aggregate, can generate 3 times China's 3 gorges. That means about 500,000 megawatts power. We have the technology, not only in construction and also transmission, and that can meet half of the demand for Africa by 2050. There are a lot of small hydro, there are a lot of natural gas. And by the way, for India too, and the World Bank is right now working with Indian Grid and trying to build quite a few hydro in Nepal and Bhutan and move that power into India. So that's part of the solution. I'm not saying it's all the solution. Certainly, NGOs will be very, very nervous about this, and there will be a lot of pushback. But I can't imagine. I mean, for Inga, by the way, the cost estimate, you talk about 2 cents. At the generation level, it's about 2 cents.